ready to go. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know a lot of people wanted to come, and it's not necessarily the favorite night to be out, but we earnestly appreciate you coming out. So I see some familiar faces, so welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. If you haven't, on your way in, we have a guest book that we love to have people sign. That way we know how many people have come, and we can also let you know what else is happening here. So we send out 2 emails a month with the many events that we have here. Let's see, what else? I said thank you. I said sign in. Restrooms are downstairs. There's an elevator or stairs that way. Hot water. Oh yes, there is hot water and tea on the back table there. So if at any point you need to get something to warm you up, go ahead and do that. We are very happy and grateful to have Dyani White Hawk here to give a version of a presentation that I heard this fall at the Art Changes conference. That was a gathering of artists and creatives. And I don't know how else to explain it because it sort of went by me really fast. But one of the things that I remembered was just visually and non-visually aesthetically pleasing to me was a presentation that came toward the end of the conference over at the MIA. And I think we'll get a version of that, but an even better discussion because we have Heid Erdrich here who is going to, I think, enrich and direct the conversation that I think will be really engaging. So I'll let you guys come up and just start the conversation. That's good. Thanks for.
Yeah, I was wondering if once I sat down here, if I'd still be able to see everybody. So good evening, everybody. Maybe we'll just introduce ourselves, both of us, real quick, and then I'm going to give a version of the presentation Clarence was talking about, and then Heid will facilitate our discussion session. My name is Dyani White Hawk. Hello, friends and relatives. My name is Dyani White Hawk. You see Dyani White Hawk in the art world because that's easier for everybody to understand because I've had many iterations of my name over the years. My husband's last name is Hawk, so my full name is White Hawk. I am Sičáŋģu Lakota through my mom, a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, which is in south-central South Dakota, and I am German and Welsh American through my dad, painter and mixed media artist who has been dabbling in installation, video, and multimedia genres lately as well.
Hi, Heid Erdrich, Dakota King in the Chubagay, the Kakwa Heid Erdrich. I'm from North Dakota originally, and I'm a teacher down in Ojibwe. I've been living in Minneapolis or St. Paul for something close to almost 30 years now, 20-some years. 14 in St. Paul and 13 in Minneapolis, so you can add that up. And was able to meet Dyani and see her work early on in her career, and so I think about her work a lot. I live with 2 of her pieces, one from her early days and one that I snatched up that has a quillwork quality to it because I knew that it was the last chance that I could afford it. And I've been thinking of Dick Dyani for a long time, so we'll see if they match what happens in the presentation.
Before I started this quick, when Clarence asked me to come and do this talk, he had heard a previous talk, and I'll touch on that, but then he wanted to make sure that there was someone here to facilitate a good conversation and that knew my work well. And Heid was curating the Ancient Traders Gallery, so the precursor to the All My Relations Gallery, which was across the street, was the Ancient Traders Gallery, and Heid was curating there. And that, so my first exhibition experience, Heid was a curator. So she's literally been there since the beginning of any amount of me moving into the realm of exhibiting out in the public. And then she also curated my first solo exhibition at the Mobley Gallery. And Todd is here tonight. And, oh, so, you know, and aside from that, we have many other intersections as well, but she's been an extremely strong supporter and friend, and so when he asked, you know, to have somebody else come out and do this with me tonight, Heid were the obvious choice for me. So I appreciate you being here. So as I stated before, I'm predominantly a painter and a multimedia artist. So my studio practice is an amalgamation of acrylic and oil painting and materials and practices that are a part of Lakota artistic traditions. So beadwork and porcupine quillwork are often either directly worked into canvases as a part of the painting, or there's references, visual, contextual, or motifs that reference those histories as well. So in some way, form, or fashion, the works are all a combination of those artistic histories. And this is just an example of one of the ways that those come together. So this piece is a small 8 by 8 inch piece that was part of a 4-piece series, and it's just titled Black and White 4. But so that you have an example of how those elements all come together. The outside is acrylic paint on linen, and then the red star in the center and the dark brown and white checker are all done in porcupine quillwork, and then that's edged in beadwork. Is there anybody here today that isn't familiar with what porcupine quillwork is? Don't be shy if you don't know what it is. Everybody knows. That's amazing. That never happens. Usually I have to give people hip people to what porcupine quillwork is, because most folks aren't aware of what it is. So, so that's exciting. Thanks everybody for being awesome. All right, can go to the next slide. And these two pieces are part of an ongoing series where I'm beading on top of canvases. And they're a continuation of a previous series that was incorporating the shape of moccasin tops on paintings, and those moccasin tops were acting as stand-in figures that were an effort to create a motif in a painting that would have agency and personality and act as a central figure, but without being necessarily attached to specifics of age or gender or anything that when you start using the actual human body come into play. And so I have been using these moccasin tops for a long time, and then I was using the part where you put in your foot as like a doorway. And so these pieces are a continuation of that, where this arc is starting to serve both those functions as a central figure, but also an entry point into the pieces. But the beadwork is done over top of these stripe painting backgrounds. And so when you're in academia and you're learning about the trajectory of abstraction, it's, as most of us are aware of now, it's a field that's really been dominated predominantly by white men. And the history of abstraction has been written by, and white male painters have been uplifted as the makers of those movements. But it's very, very common as you're studying
certain eras of abstraction, there's always the side note of, oh, and so was looking at this indigenous art form, or so was looking at these, was living near these native folks and had interactions with them, and that's a pretty common practice, but it's always this, oh, and they were looking at, and so when I was in grad school, and I kept trying to kind of find my place of where I exist as a Native woman in the continuum of art history, and it was those intersections that interest me the most as somebody who loves painting, but also loves Lakota art forms. And for me, I'm in love with those painters. I love their work, but I also love their work because there's aspects of their work that remind me of our work. And so these pieces, where I'm beading on top of those motifs, is a gesture that's meant to rearrange those hierarchies and how we think about and who we acknowledge when we're thinking about those hierarchies. Instead of, instead of saying, color field and abstract stripe painting as led by Mark Rothko, it's an effort to make audiences, they're forced to acknowledge beadwork and quillwork and indigenous arts either a beat before or at the same time as the stripe painting that's below it. Because the reality is those art forms were all happening at the same time and being influenced by one another. Excuse me. I really believe that abstract art wouldn't look the way it was today if those artists weren't looking at and gaining influence from indigenous artists, and vice versa. Indigenous art, native art would not look the way it was today had we not had trade relationships with non-native people, had we not had relationships with non-native people and been catering to those specific markets and those specific aesthetic preferences, where our histories are completely intertwined and they're inseparable. But that's not the way it's taught in academia. So these works are meant to poke at and prod at and encourage people to think about how we tell those stories, and that to tell them in a more honest way, in a more inclusive way. You can. And then this is the beginning of the latest series that I'm working on now. And this piece is at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it's up on display now. And the second floor, they have a show that's called New to Mia. So it's new acquisitions to the Minneapolis Institute of Art. It's a beautiful exhibit. You should go up and check it out. There's a lot of great work up there. But so this piece, I've been mimicking beadwork and quillwork in paint for years. I think I started exploring it in around 2009, and in 2010 started creating works that were painted to look like beadwork and quillwork. And it was a product of grad school again, because I had come out of tribal college experiences where I was doing beadwork and quillwork as part of my artistic production, and that was very normal there, and it all made sense. And then I got to grad school, and I had to figure out how to continue to do those practices and somehow make it fit to the expectations of a mainstream grad school curriculum or process or whatever. Like, I knew I couldn't just sit down and make a pair of moccasins, and they would be like, you have to conceptually defend why this is a part of your contemporary art practice and blah, 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 blah. So I had to really play around and figure out how to do that. And so I had done this giant painting that had like 77 inches worth of quillwork in it. And it took me months. And I quickly figured out that quillwork does not fit the grad school calendar. So then I had to figure out how to keep those things, the conversations and the stories and the pieces of my identity that are embedded in those practices. I needed to keep them going, but faster, which is its own whole set of conversations. And so I started mimicking it in paint, and I realized that even by mimicking it in paint, it was still filling me in the way that I needed when I was actually physically doing the practice. And so it's been a part of larger compositions of my paintings since then, since 2010. But this is the first piece where I decided to just let that be the conversation. So this is the first piece where the entire thing is just that. It's just that aesthetic that pays tribute to beadwork and quillwork. And it's each piece is untitled, but the name of the series is called Quiet Strength. And this first piece is meant to honor the generations of Lakota women who have contributed to Lakota art forms and abstraction and to the field of abstraction at large. Because historically, porcupine, quillwork, and beadwork were female artistic practices. Today, men and women practice, but back in the day, all the pieces that you see in collections that's work that's done by women, and that's another part of that story that's really important that I like to drive home to people is when they're talking about abstraction and that man was looking at this and that man was looking at this and that man was looking at this, he was looking at women's work. And seeing the strength and the vitality and the expertise of that work and the power of it, so much so that it inspired what he was doing. And that's an important piece to think about because we've not we as in like me and Heid actively, but other folks have uplifted, the male aesthetic as superior for so long, and the reality is just that's not the full honest picture. So this piece pays tribute not only to the indigenous artists that are important to my lineage, but it also pays tribute to one of my favorite female abstract painters, who's Agnes Martin. So this piece is like a combination of my affection and a homage to female abstraction at large. You can switch. And so these are the next couple pieces in the series. And so this idea, quiet strength, is I want to talk about how there's a lot of different kinds of intelligence in the world, and there's a lot of different kinds of strength. But in the same way that we've created hierarchies in how we acknowledge artistic practices in the art world, we also have created hierarchies in how we acknowledge and value certain kinds of strength and certain kinds of intelligence. We look at academic or book smarts as that's what the definition of intelligent is, but there are so many different kinds of intelligence. And one of the things that I think about, like I'm married to an athlete, and I know damn well that my brain does not connect to my body in the same way that my husband's does, and he can do things that I will never be able to do. And I recognize that that's a form of intelligence that I don't possess, right? Or at least to the level that he does, right? And so that's something that I've thought about a lot, and we all have, different people, individuals, communities, we all have specific kinds of things that we're really gifted at and then areas that we struggle in it. And we all know that from a human level. The same thing with strength. There's different forms of strength, and historically we have not, in this country, have not acknowledged the fierce strength that is the feminine force, that is female strength. And so these pieces are about that, about acknowledging that feminine strength that's, and feminine and male strength come in a wide variety, right? But this is about that quiet, unwavering female strength that is like your foundation, that isn't always about physical prowess, that isn't always big and bad and boastful, but is unwavering and is solid and is nurturing and loving and never stops. That strength that we all know. And the way that I've kind of explained this to people is most folks know at least one woman in their lives who, if she shoots you that look, you are not going to challenge her. That's what I'm talking about. That is a specific strength, that is a feminine strength, that is unique and amazing. And so these works are all about paying tribute to that. You can go to the next one. And this is just a detail. Those are really large paintings. They're 84 by 60 inches, and so this is a detail or a close-up of the brushwork that creates those pieces. Next one. And this is the first of, there's a second one that's come after this, and it'll be a continuation. And it's a continuation of that series, of the sheet, of the Quiet Strength series, but it's kind of its own branch, and these ones have the title, She Gives. And this is an acknowledgement that moves beyond human feminine strength, that acknowledges all of our mother, and acknowledges the land, and the way that the land has that same unwavering strength, and the gifts that she gives. And so when I was making this piece, I was thinking a lot about that unyielding force that nurtures and cares for us all, that feeds us all, that shelters us all, that gives us water, stone, animal relationships, glass, sand, copper, all the elements, all of these gifts that we need to survive, and we often we forget. We take that for granted. We take those gifts for granted, and we just move on. And so I was thinking a lot about the ideas of reciprocity while I was making this piece, and how do you acknowledge this strength, that strength, and those gifts in the way that we live our lives, that are daily choices. How do we start talking about that more often in a way that that encourages compassion and gratitude, not only between one another, but also between our relationship to the land. And so this is these are a few of the pieces that I've started dabbling in recently that don't hang on walls. So I was asked to come and do a presentation for the I always get their title messed up, but Women's Global Rights, or Global Rights for Women, the organization in Minneapolis. They do amazing advocacy work for women's rights literally across the globe, and they're the first of their kind, and it was started here in Minneapolis. And so they asked me to come and do a presentation about women's rights, and specifically within the Native community. And for over a month I hesitated, and I said, no, I think you should pick someone else. I think you should pick someone else. I'm just an artist. All I do is paint. And so they kept saying, no, we've thought about this really carefully. We'd really like you to do it. So I was out running one day, and I was like, how can I talk about, they gave me 7 minutes. 7 minutes to talk about violence against Native women. And I don't know if you all know, but per capita, Native women suffer the highest rates of violence in our country. Black and Native women are the largest targets, and so the statistics are terrifying. The realities in our lives and in our relatives' lives and in our families and our history is terrifying. And the rate at which Native women are missing and murdered and suffer domestic violence and our generations of trauma due to this kind of violence is huge. And so I thought really hard about how I was going to cover that in 7 minutes, and so I was out for a run. And this piece popped in my head while I was running. And so what I did is I made these t-shirts, and this was at a big fancy gala, dresses and wining and dining, and everybody's having fun. And presenters are coming up and talking, and people are, kind of listening, kind of having just fun while they're doing things and enjoying their table. But we really wanted them to listen. So before we went out, we all lee-leed really loud. And so we lee-leed really loud, and everybody was just like, they all just kind of shh, and nobody spoke. And so I sent my daughter's this one on the far left in the I Am t-shirt, sent her out first, and I asked her to hold the stage on her own for 5 seconds. And so she went out, and she just stood on the stage in front of everybody with a t-shirt that just said, I am. And then we did that successively. Each one of us would go out and join her and pause for a count of 5 seconds. And then the next would join her, so that we would create this, I am more than your desire. I am more than your fantasy. I am more than a mascot. I am ancestral love. struggle with this every time. Ancestral love, prayer, and sacrifice. I am your relative, and then you can go to the next one. And then we turned, and it says Indigenous, Dakota, Ojibwe, Dene, Apache, Quechan, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, so those are all of our tribal affiliations. And then we turned around again. I don't think I have that slide on here, but our 4 friends moved to the back, and me and my daughter turned around and took the stage, in front, and held hands, and it just says, I am your relative. So and then after we did that, I talked to them about how in Lakota Worldview, our worldview is really based on a sincere acknowledgement of the fact that we are all related. Human to human, we're all related, but beyond that, we're all related to all life, and that we're all deeply interconnected. And animal life, plant life, stones, waters, everything, everything is connected, and that's the fundamental understanding of our people. And so I talked about how, for Native women, if you think about animals, the outlier, the person that's ignored, the person that doesn't have that protection of their relatives, the person that is off to the side, they are the easiest prey. And predators know that. Think about how often you do or do not hear Indigenous people mentioned in any field. Think about how frequently you do or do not hear Native people mentioned in mass media, on your TV, at your doctor's office, at your grocery store, in any field that you're in. Where do you see Native people? When do you hear them? When do you hear people talked about in your work, in your field, and what you do throughout your daily lives? It's extremely infrequent. And so when we're not actively in the mind of the American mindset, when our people are forgotten, we become easy prey, and that is the situation on our reservations. Men know that they can go to reservations and not be persecuted. And the law supports that. We're not allowed to try non-tribal members in tribal courts. So there's a lot more that goes into that. But so that piece was all about kind of setting up this acknowledgement that it's all of our responsibility to actively look out for one another as relatives. And then a friend of mine, Jovan C. Speller, Jovan Cobb Speller, she's an amazing woman she works at MRAC now as a programs coordinator or program officer. She just got a position there, sorry, but she is an artist. She's a photographer and a curator, and she was awarded the Minnesota Artist Presents at the Walker last year. So that grant gives you a pot of money to go in and curate a night at the Walker where you take over all of the public spaces in the Walker for one night. And Jovan had been thinking about the ideas of her night was curated around the theme of claiming home, an act of oh no, now I didn't understand. What?
I can't remember.
An act of a right, a privilege, or an act of trespass. So for her, she's African American, and she had been in her own practice doing a lot of research into her lineage, and had been spending time and thinking about her family stories, that they had owned this plot of land that they had eventually inherited that was the plantation on which her father's family had been slaves for generations. And then their family ended up acquiring and owning this piece of property, and then they lost the land through sale, family drama, that kind of stuff, and then they acquired it back. And she'd been thinking a lot about what does it mean to own that property, and then for her, what does it mean to own that piece of property knowing that it's indigenous land? And so she's just a really wonderful and bright woman, and so she messaged me and asked me if I wanted to collaborate with her to curate this night at the Walker. And so we really intentionally focused on Black and Native women's voices that night. So we invited additional artists to collaborate with us to create works in those spaces that really focused on inserting voices into the walker that have not necessarily been focused on. So this piece is called Understanding Her Here, and all I did was ask two Dakota friends of mine to come in and speak Dakota in a walker gallery for 20 minutes. So my friends Gwen Westerman and Neil McKay, I asked them, I said, all I want you to do is, I'm going to invite you to come and be in a walker gallery, and I just want you to speak Dakota for 20 minutes. I don't care what you say. I don't care what your conversation is. You choose what you want to talk about. You can have a Dakota conversation amongst yourselves. You don't have to tell anybody what you're saying. Or if you want to go back and forth between Dakota and English and speak to the audience and engage the audience too, that's great. But it's your choice. You do whatever you want. All I want is for Dakota voices to be in the walker. This is post the scaffold, post Jimmy Durham stuff. So this is very intentional to invite Dakota people, Dakota language to be spoken in that space, to hold space, to be centralized in that gallery. And I want to pay you for it, because that's another thing that tends to happen. Lots of Native advisory committees come help us do this, come help us do that, or we're going to come in and pick up the pieces after you've messed up, but we often don't get paid for those things. So the whole point was just to centralize the people, the language, the space, and to honor them through reciprocity, right? To give them gifts of gratitude. So I gave them, gifts which fulfilled our cultural protocol, but also paid them to be there. And that was the performance. So it wasn't this curated action, but so much more of a intervention, I guess, in the space. And they did awesome. They talked about the differences between Dakota and English language. They talked about star knowledge. They talked about Dakota perspectives, and they actually covered a lot of ground in 20 minutes. And they decided to share a lot with the audience, which was really nice. And do the next one. And then this last piece that I'll show you, this is the clip, and then I'll show you a small video clip. Do we have sound hooked up to this or no? I might not be able to show you the video. But, oh look. So Jovan and I did a collaborative video together, and it's titled Braids. And we wanted to create a piece that was a subtle suggestion to folks, because we recognize that there's a lot of division between our communities, between the Black community and the Native community. There's a really unnecessary divide that has historical reasons as to why it is. And we have really unique histories, but we also have suffered a lot of similar traumas because of the history of our country and the very strategic ways that the U.S. government has aimed to control our communities. And it's really unfortunate the way that those divides are, because we could be, should be amazing active allies for one another. And so Jovan and I wanted to create this piece that focused on one of our commonalities. And so one of those commonalities being the idea of braids and braiding, but more specifically, how we care for one another or nurture one another through that process. So the video toggles back and forth between two young women who are getting their hair braided by two other young women that are like anti-age, right? So that it's my daughter again, because she's free and available, and we'll say yes when I ask her. And then another family friend of Jovan's, and they're getting their hair braided by two women that would be like the age of their aunties. And then the voiceovers are me and Jovan's mom's voiceovers, and we asked them a set of questions that was around their experiences of home and their notions of home, and around their experiences of hair, of braiding. And so they go back and forth, and you get to hear their stories, and it just toggles back and forth between their experiences. but we played it on the Jumbotron and we asked them to turn it up as loud as possible so that these two women's voices filled that space and was unavoidable. And what was really beautiful about it is you get to hear those stories that in the ways that they are unique, but you also get to hear their similarities and their intersections. Yeah, and so this next one is just, it's a 30-minute video, which you can't watch, but this is just a short clip so you get a sample of what it was, or it is, and then I'll pass it over to Heid.
Were those rocks there, or
Those are just like big cushions
big
that are
cushions? They
seating,
look like
yeah.
rocks.
I know, aren't they cool?
Did you ask for them to be there, or they were just
No,
already there?
that's just part of their, that's just the seating they have there, which
Okay.
I love, yeah. You should be able to press play within the,
No, there's no control.
hover over it, is it?
We didn't, like, I didn't really get a chance to begin to love and appreciate, you know, the whole experience connected to Black women and hair until James Brown came out with I'm Black and I'm Proud, you know. So that was huge, you know, because that was the first time that we began to see, you know, begin to understand, you know, the beliefs that had become a part of our just assumptions about ourselves, you know. So our hair was, you know, bad hair, nappy hair. Mom's hair was good hair. She doesn't know what to do with our bad hair. Only way that we can possibly look pretty is if she straightens it, and you know, then we dream all night of what it's going to look like when we wake up.
My next memory of hair is seeing this little brown girl standing on a chair in this mudroom of this farmhouse, standing in a chair in front of a sink that had a mirror over it, crying as she's pulling her hair, trying to get it to be long again. And I realized years later that that was me. And I was crying because my hair had gotten cut off. My adopted mom always, that's when I started hearing things like, your hair is so scraggly, that's why we had to cut it. She always used that word scraggly, it still always made me feel bad. So back then it was common for mothers to cut and perm their daughter's hair. And so that's what happened to me.
So that's just a quick little sample of what is a 30-minute long video of them sharing their experiences. But I like that in that moment you get to hear how both of them, even though this act of nurturing, like between family members and between relatives and friends, is this nurturing element in both of our communities, both of our moms ended up having these experiences where they had deep shame imposed on them about their beautiful hair. You know, and that's just, they're both symptomatic of the racism that has been such a insidious part of our country's history. So it's just a fascinating thing once you start talking among other community members outside of your own immediate circles. You know, we've all had such similar experiences. You know, there's ways that we can continue to support one another even if our experiences aren't exactly aligned. So that's all I have to share, and pass it over to Heid.
Well, I think we should give some appreciation to Dyani for those beautiful words. I feel really lucky because I did see that piece that you showed at the Walker after that night when the installation was, or when the takeover of the Walker was happening. And one of the things I remember about it is there's a lot of humor in it too. And there's this moment where the one person calls her mom on the phone, and so there's this sort of really frank recording of the conversation that just gives it a lot of shape because of the intimacies between the different women, even over a telephone, answering questions about you know, the commonalities. And it's a beautiful little film. But it occurred to me, looking at both the performance that you curated and invented, and the film that these are the performance with the t-shirts. These are recent shifts away from your painting practice. So I wonder what that's like for you. Is it a distraction? Is it a deepening? What sort of way would you talk about moving into these other genres?
Scary. So it's not something that I ever intended to do, and that t-shirt piece was the first piece that ever came to me that was like, I gotta do it. And I think the reason why I felt I had to do it was, one, this like urgency of how do you create deep impact and hit home with an audience in 7 minutes. And because that piece like literally popped into my head fully formed while I was running, I've been taught that running is prayer. And there's certain pieces that have come fully formed like that while I've been sleeping, during dreams or at that moment that I feel are really special pieces that I feel like you get help with outside of your own creative process. And when that happens, I've always felt like it's really important to see those pieces through. So that was, I felt like I had to see that one through. But it was scary because it was the first time I ever did like a performance piece, even though it was just, mostly it was like 24 hours of me making t-shirts in my studio. But, and then the video and the installation pieces, that night that Jovan asked me to collaborate on with her, the whole purpose is to take over the public spaces in the Walker. You're not allowed to go in and like hang paintings. And so I was forced to create works that weren't paintings. And it was scary and intimidating. But now I just got done writing a grant, and I received a grant to do more video work. So apparently I'm going to keep doing
I noticed that.
But it's so it wasn't a planned evolution, but I'm excited about it, and I'm excited about this next project, and it just I feel like is going to give me the ability to present a lot of the things that I'm already talking about in paintings, but in a different format. And I am really excited about that, and I'm excited about the fact that it allows me to collaborate with folks. Like with that video, Elizabeth Day, who's an Ojibwe filmmaker, she did the video work. And I got to, call up Elizabeth and say, hey, do you want to work on this really awesome project with us? And so for the video work that I'm going to continue to do, I'm going to work with Rizal Benali. And she's a Lakota and Dene filmmaker, and I love the fact that I get to collaborate with other women that's their chops, that's their area of expertise. I don't have to learn how to be a filmmaker, but I can work with friends, give them work, support them, and also, I benefit off their greatness, and so we have this great reciprocity going on between each other, and that's really exciting for me.
I didn't get to see the performance, your first performance, the piece with the t-shirts, but I saw it on social media in images, and I thought, wow, that's just brilliant. It's just so brilliant. It's an embodied poem, and for somebody who works in abstraction and doesn't use the language or the narrative or the literal that much, I thought that was just a great leap into, but such an important one, and I believe that it came to you the way it did because it requires women's bodies to be present. And when you're trying to talk about, the assaults on women's bodies and what Native women pay with the invisibility of their bodies, I just thought it was just a brilliant moment of poetry. So I love that work particularly. And I'm glad you're going to do more of that too, because do more public works and film works. It'll be really interesting. I didn't bring up my timer, so I don't want to lose track of time, but
7:56. I don't know how much time we have.
It's a little before 8.
Yeah, what time are we supposed to go to, Clarence?
Because I'd like to be, okay, because I'd like to give everybody else a chance to maybe ask some questions too. Is that, were you anticipating that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I have a half an hour.
Okay, good. Yeah, so another thing from the work that you showed, and I was lucky enough to visit most of those pieces in person, is I'm really interested in how your work has moved toward creating a sense of movement in the piece. Part of it's the geometry. How does that work for you? How do you come to know how the piece is it a discovery as you begin to work on it, or?
I'm glad you asked that question. So what I understand is when you're talking about as far as movement in paintings, that's an element of the work that I really strive to create each time. So for me, the strongest pieces that I've experienced of other artwork in my life are pieces that I feel my body responds to before my mind responds to. There's certain works that you can stand in front and you get this physical reaction before you go to the cognitive place. And those have always been my favorite work. So it's something that I've always aspired to create in my own work. And I feel that when I'm in the presence of great Lakota artwork, but great beadwork and quillwork and all of and basketry and weaving and all of, I've spent a lot of time in collections. And so there's certain works that, I feel that movement and that presence, and they are not stagnant. And I also feel that when I've studied and stood in front of color field and stripe painting, they do the same thing. And that was one of the things that got me to start researching their intersections. And there's logical ways to explain those things, the way that those paintings breathe or the way that the beadwork breathes. Part of it is from the variables, like in a large color field, all the subtle variables in a color field, all the layers that build up a color field painting. The reason why when you start in front of a Rothko, the reason why it breathes is because of the many, many, many layers and subtleties in a particular color. So it moves, right? And when you're looking at like a woman's traditional dress that's beaded and it has these large areas of a single color, it does the same thing because there's all these variables in the dye lot or in the size of the bead, so it creates rhythm, patterning, and your eyes can like dance in this big field of a single color, but there's light and shadow and all of this in it, so it has that same quality. But it's also, I think there's also a presence, that's embedded in the intentionality that goes into creating those works, and the prayer and the spirit and all of that. And so I think all of those things are a part of it. But I want my paintings to do the same thing. I want them to breathe. I want them to move. And so part of that is playing with illusional depth. I like to play with a very shallow illusional depth, so it feels like you can kind of get in, or like you maybe just stick your finger in a certain place, because it plays with your eyes, and it alludes to dimensionality. So the Trompial kind of style of painting is something that I utilize, but it also comes through repetition and the geometry, but variables within that repetition, so that those paintings that look like they're all white paintings, there's not really any white in them. It's, subtle variations of really light pinks and greens and blues and browns and grays, and but then when they're all together, they look monochromatic, but they move.
A similar question about materials used in a couple of the larger paintings that might have appeared to be white fields. There's actually gold leaf in one, and I assume the copper is a metallic too, having looked at it. Those are such different materials. They have a sort of, they could, even though they're reflective, they're flatter, weirdly.
Mm-hmm.
What is it using those materials? How did you come to using them, and how do they align with what we might think of as different from beadwork or natural materials like quills?
I've been using gold in my practice since I was an undergrad. Since I think the first piece I used gold leaf in was at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And it was in this little triptych that was called Once Upon a Time When People Were Aware. And it was all about, it had elements of like Mayan culture and Plains culture and different cultural references that talked about when people lived with an unawareness of their relationship to the land. And so, gold is a part of, an important part of those cultures. And so that was in there, embedded in there. But then I've continued to use it thinking about value systems. So a lot of these pieces, gold is the underlying, one, because it's beautiful, and I am aesthetically attracted to it. It's pretty. But also because I like to put it under things and then quill or bead on top of it with the same kind of like hierarchical shift as the other stuff. And so I think a lot about value systems and how as humans we create value systems and assign values to certain materials, and then we decide that this one's higher than this one and this one's higher than this one, but depending on who you're around, they're going to have different definitions and different ideas of what is of highest value. And quillwork, in my mind, and in a lot of Native women's mind, is at the top of a lot of those lists. And the practice is extremely valued. I know plenty of Native women that would take great beadwork and quillwork over diamond earrings any day. Like, propose to me with some dope quillwork and we're good to go. Like, I used to tease my husband about that all the time. He picked this out, by the way. But it's so differing value systems, and we assign those values. They're arbitrary, right? But so the copper piece is just a continuation of that thought process and the recognition of the fact that depending on what people you're talking to and what they see as of highest value, copper has medicinal qualities that gold doesn't have. Copper can, I'm just lost the word. Purify, thank you. Water. Gold can't do that. But gold has all the monetary value because we've assigned it as such, right? So it's just, being able to talk about those things. But all of those things, gold, silver, copper, quills, stone, ice, all of that are gifts from the land, and we've just assigned particular values to them. So it's just a way to kind of talk about those things.
Thank you. I'm gonna just do one trippy question because it wouldn't be me if I didn't. It's really cold right now, and we could talk about the weather, which we probably will for the next several days. It's going to be colder. And for me, growing up on the prairie in North Dakota, I always wondered, how did my ancestors survive? What did they do to survive? And I knew pretty early on telling stories was part of it, and you've talked a little bit about stories in your work and how the stories are there in the work. But I wondered if you thought that there's something in American Indian art or aesthetic that is time travel.
That is time travel. Oh man. I wish I could answer this with Heid greatness. I think that, yeah, I guess. I don't know if we would think about it in the same way, but I think that the links that are there are undeniable. And when I first, I'm going to go all over the place with this just because I wasn't ready for it. When I first started doing quillwork, so quillwork was gifted to us, the story of quillwork, the way that it was gifted to us by double-faced woman, double woman, an Lakota, and the story goes that she's working on this blanket or this robe, and every night when she goes to sleep, her dog chews it up. And it ends at, like, if she ever finishes that blanket, it kind of insinuates that it's like the end of our people. And I've always interpreted it as it's like signals it's the end of the world or the end of Lakota people or the world or whatever. But I just I understood it as this thing that, like, this thing can't be lost, this thing can't be dropped. And so I was like, well, I gotta learn how to do quillwork. I gotta do my part. But who knows how old those stories are or how old those relationships are, and it's really fascinating to learn over the years. Like when we another relative of mine told me that our stories, our like creation stories and our different cultural stories, they're built in a way that you're supposed to understand them differently at different stages of your life. And so when you're really young, they kind of teach you, don't do this and don't do that. Like this is gonna lead you down the wrong path, or you're gonna be physically in danger or whatever, and they seem really literal. And then when you move into like middle life, you understand them in a very different way than when you're an older adult, and they become more metaphorical, and because you have more life experience, you understand them in a much deeper worldly sense. And both stories, I guess, and those practices, I think, they link us to times that we may not have physically lived. Maybe we don't understand what it takes today to physically live in these elements. We're never going to understand that. And I've thought about that a lot as I was building my practice, as I was in grad school and thinking about the need to learn how to do what I had to do and do it fast, and that contradicted the value system that is quillwork and contradicted the value systems that I thought about that were embedded in the beginnings of those practices. Like the fact that I had to do this thing that is so important. I needed to do it for my own self, but I had to do it by tomorrow. Like that felt so ugly, but it also felt like I had to, for whatever reason. So I don't know if that's not a direct, like that means time travel, but I feel like it speaks to the lineage of time, and that there's, so a lot of my work has been about that like where, culture is always moving, and in order to stay alive, culture has to move. It has to respond to today, to the current situations, to the current environment, and it always has, and it always will. And if we stand still, if we don't continue to travel, then that's when culture's lost, right? And so a lot of, I've done, a number of the pieces that I've done have been about that, about the fact that like we're linked to our roots, to those stories, to our previous, to our ancestors and our relatives, but we continue to move and morph and change, and that has to happen.
That was fantastic. I love that answer. Okay, this one will be the short answer form. When you're working like that incredibly intricate work that you do, does time slow up or contract, expand? How would you describe it, or does it just a few words?
I definitely get lost in the process, and it is very meditative. It also makes my body hurt though, so sometimes it feels like it takes a really long time, because I get kind of...
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I mean, it seems ridiculous that writing makes your body hurt, but after any practice where you have to hold, I totally understand that.
Yeah, so a little bit of both.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, I'm so grateful to everybody who came out tonight in the bad roads and the kids not going to school. People I see once a year, some people I only see on social media. Just wonderful to see everybody here, and I wondered if you had a few questions that you want to ask Dyani. Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Do you go out and get your own porcupines and quills?
No. I love this question though when folks ask about where you get your quills. I live in the city, so I can order hides online and pull the quills myself. But I have friends who live up north and are able to collect roadkill pretty easily, and that's how the majority of them get their quills. But seeing as how I don't live up north, I have been ordering hides and pulling them that way.
Anybody who knows quill workers knows that sometimes there's something nasty in a 5-gallon bucket
Yeah.
or in a freezer. In the freezer, you're like, oh.
Don't open that.
Put it before you open the freezer.
Yeah.
Popsicles are next to the porcupine.
And then do you go out and collect stuff to make the colors with too?
No, I go to the grocery store and buy Rit dye and fabric dye, and I've experimented a little bit with some natural dyes, but I've not had or given myself enough of the dedicated time to really learn all of the specifics of natural dye, because that's an entire that's another part of that conversation too. I mean, you've got to know what to harvest, when to harvest, seasonal, and then you have to learn which mordants go with which vegetal dyes, and it's an entire knowledge that I've not been privy to or taught, and it would take a serious undertaking for me to teach myself in that way too. And yeah, man, I have utmost admiration for our ancestors, because that's real science that a lot of us don't have right now. But thanks for the good questions.
Yeah, in the back.
Can you talk a little bit more about your process, especially the ideas or inspirations that doesn't come fully formed?
Yeah.
So how do you decide when something is ready to be shared with the world, something's good enough that you feel good about sharing?
When it won't stop nagging me mentally. Especially because a lot of these pieces take a really long time to make, so I'm, yeah.
Just like to get people to sit down with their hair and talk about it before I lose it all.
Yeah, well, I love, thank you for sharing that, Terrence, because it's been really important to hear from audience members. That's, it's the first time I've done anything video. It's the first time Giovanna and I collaborated. It's the first time, I've got to work with Elizabeth in that kind of way. And it was just like a heart piece, like we didn't have all the time and all the money. We were just like, let's do this thing. We one day shot it all. Elizabeth edited it, and but we've gotten a lot of good response, and we want to continue to work together, and we want to continue to, find a way or a platform to share that video. But also, Giovanna and I have been, brainstorming other ways to highlight that conversation. Like we've thought about creating performance pieces where we have women in a space actively braiding each other's hair and having conversations, cross-cultural conversations, native to Black women, and how do we start learning to nurture one another as well. How do we already know how to nurture within our own communities, but how do we start extending that outside as well? And so I'm happy to hear that it resonates. Thank you.
Did you brainstorm cross-cultural birthing traditions?
Not yet. Not yet, but I
Great
like
one.
that. Yeah, that's beautiful. And yeah, that's an important conversation right now too. Especially with the, there's been a lot of neglect of Black women in, especially in birthing. Yeah. Anybody else have any last questions? thanks for making it out on a really cold and snowy night. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dyani. It's just beautiful.
Thank you,
Marty.
Heid and Clarence. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for
Sincerely, thank you for coming out tonight. I know some people were thinking of coming and didn't. And I'm just grateful that this came together and that we're able to have this conversation. I also want to brag, because I was in a group exhibit with Dyani a few years ago at the Silk Factory. So,
Oh, right.
I loved
yeah.
your piece there, I did.
I'm not a visual artist, so I didn't feel like I necessarily belonged. But I mean, when you're writing, I guess you belong everywhere, I suppose.
Yeah, it was awesome. Can I tell them about it quick?
Yes.
Sure.
Or unless you want to? It was so cool. It was my introduction to you.
Yeah.
So there was a big exhibit at the soap factory, and so I walked in, and Clarence people would come up and sit and have a conversation with him, and he's at a typewriter in the middle of the gallery creating poetry from the conversations that you had with folks, right?
Yeah.
It was awesome. And I loved that in an opening in an art gallery, and just that like immediacy. It was just, I thought it was so cool. So yeah, you belong there.
Well, it's an excuse to listen to people and get them to talk and
Yeah.
tell stories. And and it's like I didn't have time. It's like there's so many things, and you can't take it all in. But someone is looking at everything, and something grabs someone. So I get to sit with them and let them leave their deep impression. So.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing, and it should happen more.
Uh,
Yeah, I'll have to figure that out. Thank you, Clarence.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And again, if you didn't sign the guest book, please do. And watch your inbox for the event on the 19th, because I think it's going to be pretty interesting. I think there will be pieces of it that dovetail with this. So it isn't posted yet. We just got the final information on it, like about an hour before you guys walked in the door. So otherwise, I would hand you a flyer about it right now. There is a Facebook event for it, so if you go to our Facebook page. But yeah.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So, thanks. Drive carefully going home.